The china was still warm when my son leaned in and said, "That seat's for him." Still, I didn't argue, just set my fork down and watched my own place disappear. As his father-in-law slid into my chair, the laughter turned sharp, rehearsed, hollow. While the candles flickered, I caught my reflection in the knife, steady, silent, waiting. The same glow that once meant family now felt like cross-examination. That's when I knew. This dinner wasn't humiliation, it was evidence. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The Jennings house glowed like a winter magazine spread, every surface polished, every garland aligned as though inspected by a curator. Outside, the snow caught the amber light spilling from the windows, turning the yard into something almost sacred. Inside, the laughter came in waves, loud, bright, and brittle, the kind of laughter that fills silence before it can speak. Crystal clinked, silverware chimed, and the smell of roasted turkey drifted through the air like a memory trying to hold itself together. Harold Jennings stood at the threshold, hat in one hand, a homemade pecan pie in the other. The cold still clung to his coat as he took in the sight. His son Nathan, expensively dressed, cheeks flushed from wine, leaning close to his wife Chloe. She looked every bit the magazine hostess. Fitted red dress, pearls, that smile that said everything here is perfect. Her father, Victor Caldwell, already commanded the room, booming laugh echoing over the table. Harold had built this home decades ago with his own hands, but tonight it looked like someone else's kingdom. "Dad," Nathan called out, a little too loudly, as if to remind everyone the old man was invited. "You made it." Harold smiled faintly, lifting the pie. "Wouldn't miss it." He stepped in, brushed snow from his shoes, and followed the noise into the dining room. The table stretched long, glowing beneath a chandelier he'd once installed himself. 12 place settings gleamed, crystal, china, linen napkins folded like origami. He paused. No plate, no chair with his name. Every seat claimed, every glass poured. For a second, Harold wondered if it was an oversight. Maybe someone forgot. But as he stood there, pie in hand, Chloe caught his eye and then quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the centerpiece. The silence between them said it wasn't a mistake. "It's fine," he murmured, to no one in particular, setting the pie down among the desserts. He pulled out a small stool from the corner, the one Ellie used when she practiced piano, and eased it against the far end of the table, near the sideboard. Nathan noticed, but said nothing. The conversation rolled on around him, all about stocks, contracts, and holiday trips. Victor Caldwell's voice cut through it all, deep, smug, commanding attention. "You know, Nathan," Victor said, carving into the turkey with a flourish, "in business, it's about who sits at the head of the table. That's where the real decisions are made." Chloe laughed politely, touching her father's wrist. "You've always known that better than anyone." Harold watched as Victor settled himself in the head chair, Harold's chair. The same seat where he'd said grace every Christmas since his wife, Margaret, was alive. The same spot where he'd carved turkey for his family, poured cider for his son, told stories about bridges and rivers, and the weight of steel. Now Victor's gold cufflinks flashed under the light as he lifted his wine. "To family," he said. "To family," they echoed. Harold reached for his glass, but there wasn't one. He'd poured nothing for himself. Nathan leaned close, eyes darting, voice low but firm. "Dad," he said under his breath, "please move. That seat's for him." The words hit harder than Harold expected. For a second, he thought he'd misheard. "What?" he whispered back. "Just, it's complicated, please." Harold stared at his son, searching for any trace of the boy who used to bring him hand-drawn cards, who once cried when Harold missed a Little League game. But all he saw was a man afraid of the powerful father-in-law across the table. The room seemed to freeze mid-laughter. No one spoke, yet everyone knew. Even the fire in the hearth crackled too softly, as though aware it was intruding. Harold stood, slowly, gracefully, his movements careful, deliberate. He adjusted the sleeves of his old wool sweater, nodded once, and reached for his plate. The sound of silverware on porcelain echoed like a chime through the room. Chloe glanced up, eyes darting, unsure whether to stop him or let him go. Nathan's throat tightened. Victor just kept chewing, the smirk barely hidden behind his wineglass. "Where are you going?" Chloe asked, her tone almost rehearsed. "Didn't realize I was uninvited," Harold said quietly. His voice wasn't sharp. It was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that meant something was cracking far beneath the surface. He lifted his plate, balanced it carefully in one hand, and turned toward the doorway. No one followed. The laughter didn't return. Even the clinking stopped. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was ashamed. Harold walked past the entryway mirror and caught his reflection. Older, yes, but not invisible. Not yet. He tightened his scarf, stepped out into the December cold, and the door closed softly behind him. Inside, conversation flickered uncertainly, the warmth trying to restart. But at the far end of the table, Ellie sat motionless, her small hands gripping the edge of her napkin. Her blue eyes shimmered in the candlelight, fixed on the door, where her grandfather had disappeared. The camera would hold there, on her face, trembling but silent, as a tear rolled down her cheek and dropped onto the white linen, leaving a single dark mark that wouldn't fade. Snow pushed against the windshield in thick, swirling gusts, each flake reflecting the red glow of Harold's taillights as he eased his old Buick down the empty suburban road. The radio played faint carols through static, songs that once meant warmth and laughter, now hollow echoes. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than he realized, knuckles pale, veins raised. Every turn of the wipers revealed only more white ahead, more distance between him and the house that used to feel like home. The tires hummed a low rhythm over the icy pavement. He didn't drive fast. He never did. The world seemed to slow around him anyway, caught between snowfall and memory. The sound of forks on china, of laughter that wasn't meant for him, lingered in his head. Each echo chipped away at something solid that had lived inside him for decades. He turned down an older road, the long route home. It wound through the edge of town, past dark storefronts and snow-covered mailboxes, past the church where he and Margaret were married 43 winters ago. The stained glass windows glowed faintly from the inside, casting colored light onto the snow like silent blessings. As the car crawled by, his mind slipped backward. He could almost hear her voice beside him, warm and teasing, the way she used to narrate Christmas drives. "You're drifting again, Harold. Eyes on the road, not the memories." She always said it with that soft laugh, half warning, half affection. For a moment, the present blurred into the past. He saw her in the passenger seat, wrapped in that old green scarf, her hand resting gently on his. The same hands that used to set their Christmas table with care, white tablecloth, 2 candles, their son's drawings pinned proudly to the fridge. Back then, everything was smaller, humbler, but alive. His voice broke through the quiet, steady, but heavy. "Once," he murmured, "this table was mine to set." The words filled the cabin like a confession. He let them hang there, letting the silence swallow the truth of it. The wipers squeaked again, pulling him back. He slowed near the bridge, the old iron one that arched over the James River. The same place he had scattered Margaret's ashes 5 winters ago. Snow had dusted the railing, the river below a slow-moving slate of black. He turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold. The wind bit hard, but he didn't flinch. He walked to the edge, gloved hands gripping the frozen metal rail. The water whispered below, dark and restless. "You'd laugh if you saw them now," he said softly, the words leaving his mouth as mist. "Your son, he's got his head so far up that man's shadow he can't see daylight. And that woman, your daughter-in-law, she's got him trained like a dog waiting for scraps." He closed his eyes. The grief wasn't sharp anymore. It had aged into something quieter, heavier, like a stone that refused to sink. "You were the peace in this house," he said, voice trembling. "Without you, I think we forgot what grace looked like." He stayed there a while, listening to the wind tug at the trees and the soft creak of the bridge under his boots. When he finally turned back toward the car, his face was wet, not from tears, but from the snow melting against his skin. By the time he reached home, The night had deepened. His house stood dark except for the faint glow of the porch light, one he left on more out of habit than hope. Inside, the air was still, almost sterile. The scent of pine from an artificial tree lingered, mixing with the faint must of old wood. He hung up his coat, his movements automatic, and noticed the small stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. He sat down, the chair creaking beneath him, and began sorting through envelopes, utility bills, a holiday card from an old neighbor, junk mail promising low-interest loans. Then a thicker envelope, official-looking, from the county assessor's office. Harold frowned, reaching for his reading glasses. He tore it open carefully. The paper inside smelled faintly of ink and toner. His eyes scanned the words once, twice, then stopped cold on one line near the bottom. Property tax statement. Co-ownership. Listed Nathan Jennings. For a moment, he didn't move. The clock ticked softly from across the room. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, wind brushed the window pane. He read the name again. The letters didn't change. The world around him seemed to narrow, tightening until only the words on the page remained. He set the letter down slowly, hands steady but pale. Then he leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, the sound of distant wind filling the silence. The pie he'd brought still sat untouched on the counter, frosting over in the cold kitchen light. Harold exhaled once, deep and deliberate. Something old inside him, something that had been dormant since his wife's passing, shifted. The snow outside thickened again, blurring the world beyond the window. Inside, his eyes stayed fixed on the letter, the faint tremor of realization crossing his face as the scene faded to black. The next morning broke gray and silent, the kind of winter morning that felt like it was holding its breath. Snow still clung to the edges of the streets as Harold parked his Buick outside the Richmond County Clerk's office. The building was squat and beige, government plain, with a flickering fluorescent light near the entrance that buzzed like a tired insect. He tightened his scarf, tucked the folded tax notice into his coat pocket, and walked inside. The air smelled faintly of toner and coffee. A woman behind the front desk looked up, polite but distracted, fingers tapping across a keyboard. "Morning, sir. What can I help you with today?" Harold removed his hat, his voice low and measured. "I need to verify a property filing, 145 Wisteria Drive." She nodded, clicking through her screen. "Name?" "Harold Jennings." "All right, Mr. Jennings, one moment." She disappeared into a side room. He could hear the distant whine of a copier and the shuffle of papers. Behind him, a young man in a suit argued quietly into a Bluetooth earpiece about zoning permits. The world moved on, indifferent, while Harold stood still, just an old man chasing a bad feeling. When the clerk returned, she carried a thin file. "Looks like there was a deed modification filed last month. Joint ownership listing." She laid the papers on the counter, face down, then flipped them toward him. There it was. His name, and beneath it, Nathan Jennings, his son's signature in looping blue ink, familiar handwriting slightly rushed, the same way Nathan used to sign permission slips in high school when he thought Harold wouldn't notice. "Filed November 28th, the clerk continued, unaware of the tremor forming in Harold's hand. "Listed reason, estate consolidation, per spousal request." Spousal, Chloe. He said nothing. His eyes scanned the lines again, trying to find sense where there wasn't any. The house he'd built from foundation to roof, paid off over 40 years, was now shared property, not through gift, through theft, wearing the mask of legality. "Would you like a copy?" the clerk asked. "Yes," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "2 copies." She nodded, slid the papers into the copier, and the machine began to hum. Harold stared at the original document as it fed through. The official stamp in the corner seemed to burn into his vision. His name, his own, felt foreign now, a word stripped of ownership. When the clerk handed him the copies, he folded them neatly and slipped them into an envelope. "Thank you," he said, and walked out. The cold air hit him like a wake-up slap. He stood by his car for a long moment, the wind cutting across the lot, the papers warm in his coat pocket. Rage began to rise, but not the loud, shaking kind. This was quiet, coiled, like the river under ice. He'd always believed anger was something to be controlled, But this wasn't anger. It was clarity. He drove home without turning on the radio, eyes fixed ahead. Every red light, every passing car, every snowflake hitting the windshield felt like punctuation in a sentence he hadn't finished writing. When he parked in front of his house, he didn't go inside right away. He sat in the car, staring at the windows. His windows. And yet, on paper, they no longer fully belonged to him. Inside, the house greeted him with silence. He laid the copies on the dining table, the same table that once hosted Christmas laughter, the same one where he'd been told to give up his seat. He took out his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found the number he hadn't dialed in years, Rachel Dorsey. She had worked with his late wife for decades, sharp as a scalpel, loyal as blood. If there was anyone who could untangle the legal knots Nathan had tied, it was her. He pressed call. The line rang twice. "Rachel Dorsey," came her brisk voice. "Rachel," Harold said quietly. "It's Harold Jennings." A pause, then a softer tone. "Harold, well, I'll be damned. How are you holding up?" "I've had better mornings," she chuckled lightly. "I imagine so. What's going on?" He looked down at the paper again. His fingers brushed the signature, his son's name written where it never should have been. "I think," he said slowly, "my son just stole my house for Christmas." Silence. Then Rachel exhaled, long and sharp, the sound of a professional assessing damage. "That's a hell of a gift to give your father." "Yeah," Harold replied, bitterness edging his words. She didn't miss a beat. Then Santa brought him the wrong gift. Despite himself, Harold almost smiled. "You still have that dry humor." "Comes in handy with idiots," she said. "Send me everything you've got. Don't talk to him yet. We'll start with the filings, then trace the signatures. If they forged anything, we'll know." Her tone had shifted from warmth to precision. Rachel the friend had become Rachel the tactician. "All right," Harold said, the faintest weight lifting from his chest. "Good," she replied. "And Harold, don't get angry. Get even." The line clicked. Harold sat back in his chair, the papers spread before him, the morning light crawling through the blinds. His hand brushed the wood of the table. The house still felt like his, smelled like his, carried his wife's memory in every creak. But now, beneath the surface, the betrayal had an address, a date, and a signature that wasn't his. He leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing with the calm of a man who just realized the war had already begun. The next morning, the first light over Richmond fell cold and pale through Harold's kitchen window. His coffee sat untouched, steam curling upward like the last breath of something once warm. The papers from the county office were still spread across the table, their sharp edges catching the light. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, that signature appeared again. His son's hand, confident and practiced, turning betrayal into a legal fact. He reached for his phone, meaning to check the time, but a buzz lit up the screen before he could set it down. Family chat. 47 new messages. He hadn't opened that group thread in weeks. It used to be filled with pictures of Ellie's school projects, Sunday dinner plans, and polite reminders from Chloe about family expectations. Now, the preview alone made his stomach tighten. "Chloe, we need to discuss home equity strategy." He opened the chat. Chloe's messages filled the feed, one after another, long and polished like mini press releases. "Since we're consolidating family assets," one read, "it's smart to reinvest some of Dad's home value into Nathan's expansion opportunity. The market's perfect right now." Another, "We can't let the house just sit like a shrine. A refinance gives everyone leverage." Harold stared at the glowing words, thumb hovering over the screen. The language was corporate, rehearsed, the kind used to make theft sound like family planning. Nathan chimed in mid-thread, trying to soften her edges. "It's just logistics, Dad. You don't need that big place alone. We're trying to make things easier on everyone." Harold read the line twice. "You don't need that big place alone." The phrasing was so casual, so confident, it stung worse than shouting would have. He set his mug down slowly, the porcelain clicking against the wood. He typed a single line in response. "Ownership isn't inheritance." He hit send. The message appeared, small and simple, against the long paragraphs that came before it. For a full minute, no one replied. The three dots appeared beside Nathan's name, then vanished. Chloe's profile picture lit up briefly, then her name turned gray. Chloe left the chat. The silence that followed was almost musical. Harold watched the words fade, the group icon dimming from 4 faces to 3. The family line had just split cleanly in half. He leaned back, letting the quiet fill the house. Somewhere outside, a snow shovel scraped pavement. The refrigerator hummed. Inside his chest, something old, something patient, began to wake. His phone buzzed again. A new message, this time from Rachel. Got your email. Starting the paper trail now. I'll trace filings and see if they used your original power of attorney forms from when Margaret passed. Harold exhaled through his nose, a mix of relief and disbelief. Even after all these years, Rachel still moved like clockwork, efficient, loyal, lethal when necessary. He typed back, "If they forged one document, there will be more." "Already checking," she replied. "You keep calm. Let me dig. Calm." He looked around the kitchen, the quiet house, the empty chairs, the small signs of a life once shared. Calm wasn't the word. Focused was closer. The rage from the night before had settled into something steadier now, almost methodical. He went to his study. The desk was cluttered with old files, photographs, and his wife's stationery box. Margaret's handwriting still marked the front of it. Jennings Family Records. He opened it carefully. Inside were folders of wills, bank accounts, and the estate trust they'd created years ago for Nathan's future. The irony burned. He pulled a new legal pad from the drawer, the paper crisp and ready. At the top, he wrote, "Amendments to will, effective immediately." His handwriting was deliberate, slow. He crossed out Nathan's name from the beneficiary list and replaced it with Ellie Jennings, in trust until age 21. Every pen stroke felt like reclaiming ground. When he was done, he signed his name with quiet finality, then folded the pages into an envelope addressed to Rachel's office. The motion steadied his hands. This wasn't revenge yet. It was preparation, the prelude to war. As he sealed the envelope, the late morning light cut through the window, landing on the old family portrait hanging by the door. Nathan, younger, smiling beside Margaret. Chloe's smile then had been real, or at least convincing. He studied their faces a moment, then turned the frame down so the photo faced the wall. When Rachel called later, her voice was brisk. "I've already found 3 suspicious filings linked to your address. They tried to make it look like routine consolidation, classic trick for laundering equity." "Do you think it's all Caldwell's doing?" Harold asked, voice low. "Partly, but Nathan signed everything. That's not coercion. That's complicity." He said nothing for a long time. The only sound was the soft tick of the wall clock. Rachel added, "I'll have certified copies ready for you tomorrow. Keep everything quiet for now." "Quiet," Harold repeated. "They think age means blindness." His tone wasn't bitter. It was steady, sharp, dangerous. He hung up, looking again at the empty table where the family once gathered, where the air still remembered laughter that now felt like someone else's memory. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and soundless. Inside, Harold's reflection stared back from the window, calm, calculating, and awake for the first time in years. And somewhere in that stillness, the line between father and adversary began to blur. The day after Christmas came with that hollow quiet only found in houses where laughter had overstayed its welcome. The Jennings neighborhood was still wrapped in strings of light, but Harold's house sat dim, a single wreath fading on the door. The coffee pot gurgled weakly in the kitchen, its sound echoing through the empty rooms. Harold sat in his armchair, the same one he and Margaret had bought the year Ellie was born. The Christmas tree, small and artificial, blinked in the corner, green plastic branches draped with memories that no longer belonged to him. Underneath it, a few unopened cards leaned like strangers against the skirt. He hadn't expected any visitors. The knock at the door startled him, soft, hesitant. He rose slowly, his knees protesting, and peered through the window. A small figure stood on the porch, bundled in a red coat, scarf pulled up to her chin. Snowflakes clung to her hair. He opened the door. Ellie, she grinned shyly, cheeks pink from the cold. Hi, Grandpa. He blinked, surprised. Does your mother know you're here? She hesitated. She's busy. Grandpa Caldwell's over. They're talking in the study again. He sighed quietly but stepped aside. Come in before you freeze solid. Ellie stomped her boots on the mat, shaking off snow. She held a small gift bag in her mittened hands, the paper wrinkled, the bow slightly crooked. She offered it to him like it was something fragile. I made you something, she said. He took it carefully, his rough fingers brushing the glitter glue letters that spelled for Grandpa. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she interrupted, her voice firmer than her size suggested. He nodded, pulling out the tissue paper. Inside was a framed photograph, one he hadn't seen in years. It was from an old summer barbecue, Margaret laughing beside Harold as Nathan held a baby Ellie, both of them covered in smudged ice cream. Everyone looked sunlit, alive. Tucked behind the frame was a folded note in Ellie's handwriting, scrawled with a pencil pressed too hard into the paper. Don't let them win. The words stopped him. His throat tightened. For a long moment, he couldn't look up. The wrapping paper blurred as his vision clouded. He tried to swallow, but the emotion caught in his chest. Ellie's voice broke through the quiet. I know what they're doing, Grandpa. I hear them talk when they think I'm asleep. He reached for her hand. Ellie, they say you're old and confused, but you're not. Her eyes shone with fierce certainty. You see everything. He exhaled, trying to steady himself, but the dam broke. A tear slipped down his cheek, landing on the corner of the gift bag. Then another. He hadn't cried in years, not since the night Margaret died. But something about this, about that child's small act of rebellion, stripped him of the armor he'd been wearing. He set the photo down and pulled her into his arms. She was small, but she held on tight, as if she understood he needed it more than she did. The smell of winter and peppermint clung to her scarf. You see more than they think, he whispered into her hair. She nodded against his shoulder, her voice muffled. Mom's scared of Grandpa Caldwell. He froze, the words hanging heavy between them. He leaned back to meet her eyes. Scared? She nodded again, lower this time. He yells at her when nobody's around. Says she'll lose everything if she doesn't keep you quiet. Harold felt the cold shift inside him, not from the weather, but from realization. Chloe wasn't just greedy, she was trapped. And Victor Caldwell, with all his smug power and money, had been pulling every string from the start. He brushed a strand of hair from Ellie's forehead, his expression soft but sharp. You shouldn't have to hear those things, he said gently. I don't like how he talks to Mom or to Dad. Her lip trembled. He scares everyone. Harold looked past her, toward the frosted window where faint reflections of the Christmas lights blinked weakly. His jaw set. Then I'll remind him what fear feels like. Ellie blinked. What do you mean? He smiled faintly, not unkindly, but with that quiet steel she'd only seen in old photographs, the look of a man who built bridges strong enough to outlast storms. You let me worry about that. She looked unsure, but she nodded. He guided her back toward the doorway, wrapping her scarf tighter. Go home before your mother notices, he said. And thank you, sweetheart. This, he lifted the photo, means more than you know. As she stepped outside, the wind picked up, carrying snow across the porch. She waved once before running down the path, her small boots crunching through ice. Harold stood in the doorway for a long time after she left, the cold seeping into his bones. Then he turned back inside, setting the photo on the mantel where his wife's urn rested. The note, "Don't let them win," he slid beneath the glass of the frame. He stared at it for a long while, the words burning into him. The child's courage had done what anger couldn't. It gave his purpose direction. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, blanketing the neighborhood in white silence. Inside, the old man's eyes no longer looked tired. They looked ready. And as the lights of the tree flickered weakly in the dim room, Harold whispered under his breath, almost to the ghost of his wife, "It's time, Margaret. It's time to take back what's ours." The next morning, Richmond's skyline stood sharp against the winter sky. cold steel, blue glass, and the quiet arrogance of money. Harold's old Buick looked out of place as it pulled up in front of Caldwell Tower, a 40-story monument to power with its name etched in black marble across the entrance. The building reflected the sun like a blade. Inside, everything gleamed, the floors polished enough to see yourself in, the air carrying the faint scent of leather and wealth. Harold walked past the receptionist without a word. His coat was worn, his shoes practical, but there was something in his stride, steady, deliberate, that made even the young assistant hesitate before stopping him. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" she asked, uncertain. He didn't look at her. "Tell Victor Caldwell that Harold Jennings is here." The name landed with weight. The assistant blinked, glanced at her screen, then picked up the phone. Within moments, the elevator doors slid open. "Mr. Caldwell will see you," she said, her tone suddenly careful. The elevator hummed as it rose, the numbers blinking slowly upward. Harold stared at his reflection in the mirrored wall, tired eyes, lined skin, but something alive behind it. When the doors opened, he stepped into a hallway lined with framed magazine covers. Caldwell Enterprises, building tomorrow's empire. Victor Caldwell, the architect of ambition. Victor's office sat at the end, all glass and ego. The man himself stood behind a desk the size of a small car, phone in one hand, a tumbler of whiskey in the other. He didn't bother to end his call right away. When he finally did, he leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a smirk. "Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," Victor drawled, "you must be here to thank me for raising your son's career from the dust." Harold's voice was calm even. "You took his soul as commission." Victor laughed, a low, rich sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, Harold, you make it sound so tragic. Business is just inheritance with better timing." Harold's jaw tightened, but his tone stayed controlled. "You call it timing, I call it theft." Victor swirled his glass, the ice clinking like punctuation. "Your son made choices, Jennings, smart ones. He's learning how the world works now. Don't blame me because you raised him on old rules." "Old rules built bridges," Harold said. "New ones just burned them." Victor smiled, shark-like. "Bridges are for people who can't afford jets." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Harold didn't rise to them. He studied the room instead, the skyline beyond the windows, the perfectly staged trophies on the shelf, the family photo on the desk, where Chloe smiled like a trophy herself. "I see what you've built," Harold said finally. "You think control is the same as legacy." Victor leaned forward, elbows on the desk, grin widening. "Legacy is control, old man. You should have learned that before you retired to your rocking chair." For a heartbeat, the two men just stared at each other, the patriarch who'd earned his life with sweat, and the one who'd stolen his with signatures. Then Harold straightened. "You're right about one thing," he said. "I am old enough to know that everything you build here," he gestured toward the window, "will someday belong to someone else. And when that day comes, they'll remember you the same way I do, by the mess you left behind." Victor's smirk faltered for just a second, a crack too small for most to notice, but enough for Harold to see. That was all he needed. Without another word, Harold turned toward the door. "Leaving so soon?" Victor called out. "No handshake? No truce between the builders and the buyers?" Harold paused at the doorway but didn't look back. "You don't shake hands with termites, Victor." He walked out, the sound of his shoes echoing down the polished corridor. The elevator took its time descending, the city glittering below like a promise waiting to be broken. On the ground floor, Harold stepped out into the lobby. As he passed the front desk, his eyes caught on the plaque mounted beside the elevator. Engraved brass, bold letters, Caldwell Tower, EST. 2016, property of Caldwell Holdings, LLC. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, memorizing the legal wording, the name of the parent company. Then he smiled faintly, the first hint of strategy flickering behind his calm. Outside, the wind bit at his face as he reached his car. His phone buzzed in his pocket, Rachel's name on the screen. "Did you get what you came for?" she asked when he answered. Harold slid behind the wheel, eyes lifting toward the towering glass building that pierced the winter sky. His reflection, he said quietly. He started the engine, the sound low and steady, like thunder from far away. As he pulled into traffic, the reflection of Caldwell Tower vanished from his rearview mirror, but not from his mind. By the time the afternoon sun began to slant through the blinds of Rachel Dorsey's office, the room looked more like a crime scene than a workspace. Papers sprawled across the desk in uneven stacks, folders marked with yellow tabs, and a faint smell of printer toner hung in the air. Rachel sat hunched over her computer, glasses perched low on her nose, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Lines of corporate filings flickered on the screen. Names, addresses, EIN numbers, shell LLCs, all linking in quiet, deceitful circles. Each click unraveled another thread in a web she could already see forming in her mind. When the door creaked open, Harold stepped inside without knocking. He looked composed, but there was a sharpness in his eyes now, a steadiness that hadn't been there a week ago. Rachel didn't look up at first. "You might want to sit down," she said. He took the chair opposite her desk, leaning forward. "What did you find?" She clicked the mouse once, spinning the monitor toward him. "Your son's name," she said flatly. On the screen, a company listing appeared, Jennings Development Group, LLC. Harold frowned. "He doesn't own any business by that name." Rachel nodded. "No, but he's listed as managing partner. The company's address traces back to a property owned by Caldwell Enterprises." She opened a second file. "Then there's this one, NC Construction Advisors, another shell company. Caldwell's lawyers incorporated it 6 months ago, and both accounts are tied to a shared credit line." Harold's brow furrowed. "Credit line?" Rachel's lips pressed together. "Secured by your home equity." The words landed heavy. Harold leaned back slowly, the air leaving his lungs in one measured exhale. Rachel slid a printed page toward him. "They leveraged your house, Harold. Your life's work, the place you built with Margaret, used as collateral for a deal that doesn't even exist." He didn't speak. His gaze drifted across the page, scanning signatures, seals, and numbers that turned betrayal into fine print. "They filed this under what's called collateral pooling," Rachel continued. "It's an old trick in corporate fraud. They attach tangible assets to a ghost investment, inflate the value, then use the paper to secure more loans. If Caldwell's plan goes south, and it will, you're the one left holding the debt." The clock on her wall ticked faintly, each sound cutting through the silence like a metronome. Harold's jaw worked once before he spoke. He knew exactly what he was signing. Rachel nodded. They all did. For a long moment, neither said anything. The sunlight caught the edge of a photo on Rachel's desk, her and Margaret years ago smiling outside the courthouse, 2 women who believed in justice. Harold's eyes lingered there before he looked back at her. "What's your next move?" she asked quietly. He folded the paper, aligning the edges perfectly before placing it back on her desk. "Let's give them the deal they deserve." Rachel tilted her head, recognizing the change in his tone. There was no tremor, no pain, just precision. The kind of cold resolve that built bridges and ended wars. She smirked faintly. "You've got something in mind." "I'm not fighting them as a father," he said. "I'm fighting them as an equal." Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Then we'll need a name." Harold's gaze swept over the disarray of files on her desk, the documents, the signatures, the stamps of Caldwell's empire. His voice came steady. "Jennings Holdings LLC. Let's build something that can stare his tower in the face." Rachel grinned. "Irony looks good on you." She began typing quickly, the rhythmic sound of her keyboard filling the room. "We'll file it under small-scale asset management, independent ownership. Clean, legal, invisible. I can have the paperwork ready in a few hours." Harold watched her work, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his eyes. The last few days had stripped him down, but what remained was harder, sharper, more focused. He thought about the plaque at Caldwell Tower, the arrogance carved in metal, and imagined another plaque one day, one that bore his name again, not as a memory, but as a declaration. When Rachel finished, she printed the first draft of the LLC registration and slid it across the desk. Sign here, she said. Harold uncapped the pen, his hand steady as he wrote his name. He paused for a moment after finishing, studying the ink as it dried. Rachel glanced up. Feels good, doesn't it? He nodded once. Every war starts with paperwork. She laughed quietly, shaking her head. You really are an engineer, Harold. You don't swing hammers. You lay foundations. He folded the document, slipping it into his coat pocket with deliberate care. As he stood to leave, Rachel asked, So, what do we call this phase? He looked back over his shoulder, eyes glinting under the office light. Phase 1, he said. When he stepped into the hallway, the late afternoon sun cut through the blinds, striping his face with gold and shadow. Behind him, the printer hummed, spitting out new pages, contracts, filings, and the first bricks in his quiet revenge. Revenge begins as paperwork. The text came on a Friday morning, short and polished like everything Chloe wrote. Let's have a peace brunch, for Ellie's sake. The message was wrapped in civility, but carried the tone of someone trying to manage optics, not relationships. Harold read it twice, then set his phone down beside the folded papers from Rachel's office. He could have ignored it. He'd ignored worse. But Rachel's voice from the night before echoed in his head. Let them come to you. They expect silence. Give them something else. So that Sunday, he showed up. The Jennings house was staged like a magazine again. Tulips on the counter, soft jazz playing, every surface gleaming as if guilt could be polished away. The smell of coffee and sugar glaze filled the air. Chloe greeted him at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dad, she said. She always called him Dad now, the word more diplomatic than affectionate. So glad you came. He handed her a box of pastries. You said peace. I figured we'd need something sweet to make that believable. She laughed politely, stepping aside to let him in. At the table, Nathan sat stiffly in a pressed shirt, his fingers drumming against the mug in front of him. Across from him, Victor Caldwell looked perfectly at ease, spreading butter across toast like a man entirely at home in another man's house. Harold, Victor said, voice rich and controlled. Glad to see you. We were just talking about how families should settle things at the table, not in offices. Then it's good I brought my appetite, Harold said evenly, hanging his coat. Chloe gestured to a chair near Nathan, the one furthest from the head of the table. Please, sit. Harold smiled faintly. Actually, I might take this seat. He pulled out the chair opposite Victor, the head of the table. The air tightened. No one stopped him. For a few moments, they made small talk about the weather, Ellie's school recital, meaningless things that served as camouflage. But when Nathan finally cleared his throat, everyone knew what was coming. Dad, he began, voice thin, rehearsed. About what happened. The house, the papers. I know it looks bad. We just wanted to make sure things were secure. We thought... Harold didn't blink. You thought I wouldn't notice. Nathan's face flushed. That's not... Chloe interjected smoothly. We all make decisions out of fear sometimes. Maybe we just need to reset expectations. Victor chuckled, cutting into his omelet. See, that's what I like about Chloe. Always the diplomat. He looked directly at Harold. No need to drag lawyers into family business, right? Harold let the words hang for a moment, the faint clink of silverware filling the silence. Then he leaned back, expression calm. Funny you should mention that. He turned toward the kitchen door. Rachel, he called. Every head turned as Rachel Dorsey stepped in, composed, carrying a slim leather folder. Her heels clicked softly across the floor. She smiled politely at the table. Morning, everyone. I hope you don't mind. I'm Harold's +1. Chloe's smile faltered. Nathan's mug froze halfway to his lips. Victor arched an eyebrow. This is a family brunch, he said smoothly. Good, Rachel replied. This is family business. She set the folder down in front of Victor with deliberate grace. The faint thud of it, landing on the wood, was louder than it should have been. Since you love signatures, she said, voice cutting through the air, here's one more to read. Victor's expression shifted slightly. Curiosity, annoyance, then something else as he opened the folder. Inside were printed letters on official letterhead, red stamps marking the corners. His eyes scanned the first page. The silence was instant. Rachel folded her arms, waiting. "That," she said lightly, "is a notice of preliminary audit. Caldwell Enterprises has been flagged for review by the Virginia Corporate Compliance Division." Nathan swallowed hard. "What?" Rachel continued, her voice steady but merciless. "Routine checks triggered by property consolidations tied to your father's residence. It seems someone's been creative with collateral structures." Harold sipped his coffee slowly. "You might call it inheritance with bad timing." Victor's jaw tightened. "You think a little paperwork scares me?" "Not paperwork," Harold said, setting his mug down gently. "Patterns. They scare auditors, especially when they trace back to your name." For once, Victor didn't respond. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the pause. Chloe's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her napkin. Nathan stared at his plate, every trace of confidence gone. Harold rose, buttoning his coat. "Well," he said, tone polite, "thank you for brunch. Always good to sit down as a family." Rachel followed, gathering her folder. At the door, she looked back briefly, long enough to catch Victor's face hardening as he reread the first page, his grin fading 1 degree at a time. Outside, the winter air felt cleaner. Harold exhaled, hands deep in his pockets. Rachel fell into step beside him. "First crack in control," she said quietly. Harold's eyes stayed forward. "Good," he murmured. "Let him hear it echo." They kept walking, the sound of their footsteps fading into the cold, deliberate rhythm of two people who just fired their first shot. The night after the so-called peace brunch, the Jennings house looked perfect from the outside again, lights glowing through the windows, a snowman still standing guard on the lawn. But inside, perfection was cracking. Ellie sat cross-legged on her bed, homework spread across the blanket. Through her door, she could hear her mother pacing the hallway, heels clicking like a metronome of panic. Downstairs, her father's voice rose, then fell, the words muffled but tense. It had been like that since Harold's visit, short bursts of anger wrapped in long silences. Then the silence broke for good. "Your dad will ruin everything," Chloe's voice ripped through the quiet, sharp and shaking. "Do you understand that, Nathan? Everything." Ellie froze. Her pencil rolled off the bed, hitting the floor softly. She crept toward the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Nathan's voice came back low, defensive. "It's under control. He doesn't have the reach Caldwell does." "Under control?" Chloe snapped. "You just let him walk in here with that lawyer and embarrass your father-in-law in front of the whole family. Do you think Victor's going to forget that? He'll come after both of us if this blows up." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ellie had never heard her mother sound scared before. Angry, yes. Commanding, always. But never afraid. "Calm down," Nathan said. "Dad doesn't have proof of anything. He's bluffing." Chloe's reply came fast, trembling. "He's not bluffing. That woman, Rachel, whatever her name is, she knows what she's doing. You better fix this before they drag us all into court." Ellie's heart thudded. She reached for her tablet, hands shaking, and opened the voice memo app. She hit record. The red light blinked softly in the dark. Below, footsteps moved across the hardwood. "You listen to me," Chloe said, voice lower now, dangerous. "If this old man thinks he can turn the tables, he's in for a lesson. He'll see we're not stupid." Ellie's breath caught. She let the recording run until the voices faded toward the study. Then she stopped it, saved the file, and sat still for a long moment, staring at the screen. She didn't know much about business or property deeds, but she knew right and wrong, and whatever was happening downstairs didn't sound right. She thought of the look on her grandfather's face when he'd left the brunch, calm but certain, like he already knew a storm was coming. And now she knew too. That night, while her parents slept, she slipped out of bed. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the furnace. She crept into the hallway, tablet clutched against her chest, and padded down the stairs. By the living room tree, the lights blinked in steady rhythm, casting soft shadows on the walls. Ellie opened her email, attached the file, and hesitated only for a second before typing. "For Grandpa, you should hear this." She hit send. Across town, Harold's phone buzzed on his nightstand just after midnight. He woke with a start, eyes adjusting to the dark. When he saw the sender's name, his chest tightened. Ellie. He sat up, clicked the file, and pressed play. At first, just silence and the faint creak of floorboards. Then Chloe's voice, sharp as glass. "Your dad will ruin everything." The conversation unfolded in bursts, the fear, the arrogance, the contempt. And finally, that line, "He'll see we're not stupid." Harold listened twice. The second time, he didn't flinch. He just stared into the darkness, his breathing steady. The next morning, Rachel sat across from him at his kitchen table, a legal pad beside her coffee. Harold slid his phone across. "Listen to this." The audio played. Rachel didn't move until it ended. Then a slow smile curved across her face. "Evidence with perfect timing," she said. Harold nodded. "She's smart," he murmured, almost to himself. "Smarter than any of them realize." Rachel tapped her pen against the table. "We'll timestamp and transcribe it. Chain of custody's clean since she sent it directly. This changes everything." He nodded again, quieter now, eyes distant. He reached for the small external drive beside his laptop and plugged it in. The computer chimed softly. He transferred the file, watching the progress bar move inch by inch until it turned green. Then he ejected the drive, holding it in his palm for a moment before locking it inside the drawer of his desk. The room was still. Outside, the snow kept falling. Harold looked out the window toward the pale morning sky, the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. His voice came low, almost a whisper meant for no one but himself. "This time," he said, "I'm the one watching." The camera would linger there, on the old man's reflection, the drive locked beneath his hand, and the quiet certainty in his eyes that the game had just changed. The call came just after noon, slicing through the quiet of Harold's kitchen like a knife. He'd been reviewing Rachel's latest draft of legal filings when the phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. He almost ignored it, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Mr. Jennings?" The voice on the other end was formal, cautious. "This is Martin Kessler from Richmond Federal Bank. I'm calling about your joint property line of credit." Harold's spine stiffened. "I don't have a joint anything," he said evenly. Kessler hesitated. "Sir, I'm afraid that's partially true. We've noticed some suspicious withdrawals tied to an active account under your name and a secondary signatory, Nathan Jennings." For a long moment, Harold didn't speak. The sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the corner suddenly felt deafening. "How much?" he finally asked. 48,000 withdrawn over the last 3 weeks, Kessler said, his tone softening as if bracing for anger. "We were required to verify your consent signature for compliance. But when I compared it to your previous records," he trailed off. Harold closed his eyes. "It wasn't mine." "I didn't think so," Kessler admitted. "It's, how do I put this, the same handwriting style we flagged during another case last quarter. Sloppy, but intentional. Almost traced." The words hung heavy. Harold took a slow breath, keeping his tone level. "Freeze it." "Sir?" "Freeze the account immediately." "Yes, Mr. Jennings, but I'll need an injunction or legal request to—" "You'll have it by the end of the day," Harold interrupted. "And Martin, thank you for calling me first." He hung up, staring at the phone in his hand, the edges of the screen reflecting his face. For a moment, the old ache of betrayal surged again. But this time, it didn't crush him. It refined him. He picked up his other phone and called Rachel. She answered on the first ring. "Tell me it's not worse." "It's worse," Harold said, voice low. "He forged my consent again. Withdrawals under the property line." "Amount?" 48,000. Maybe more coming." There was a pause, then the rapid clatter of her keyboard. "I'll file the injunction to freeze all assets under joint signature immediately. Caldwell's name might be buried in the back-end accounts. They'll choke when they see the paperwork lock up." "Make it airtight," Harold said. "Already doing it." She paused. "You all right?" He allowed himself a small exhale. "Better than they are." By evening, word had spread. Somewhere in a downtown office, Victor Caldwell's phone lit up like a siren. He snatched it up mid-ring, his voice a sharp hiss. "You let the old man get ahead of us?" Caldwell's tone was pure venom. "Do you understand what you've done? That freeze just shut down half my leverage." Nathan's voice shook on the other end. "I didn't think he'd catch it." "You didn't think. That's exactly the problem," Caldwell snarled. "Do you have any idea who's watching those filings now? You think I can cover you if this goes public?" "I'll fix it," Nathan blurted. "I'll talk to him. He'll listen." "Your father doesn't listen," Caldwell growled. "He waits." The line went dead. Nathan stood in his office, hands trembling, staring at his phone. Sweat prickled his neck despite the cold. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether he feared Caldwell or his father more. He called Harold. The phone rang twice before it was answered. "Dad," Nathan said quickly, voice cracking between panic and apology. "Listen, it's complicated." Harold sat at his desk, calm as a man who had already seen the entire chessboard. Papers were neatly stacked beside him, Rachel's injunction forms sealed and ready for court filing. The faint hum of his old computer filled the silence. "No, son," he said softly, his voice calm enough to unnerve. "It's not complicated. It's calculated." On the other end, Nathan's breath hitched. "I didn't mean—" "Save it," Harold said, cutting through. "You made your choice when you signed my name. Now you live with mine standing across from yours." He didn't shout. He didn't curse. His words were clean, deliberate, precise as the engineer he'd once been. "Dad, please," Nathan said, desperation seeping in. "If Caldwell finds out you're freezing his assets, he'll—" But Harold had already ended the call. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the small lamp beside the window. Snow drifted outside again, silent and steady. He picked up the external drive from the drawer, the one holding Ellie's recording, and set it beside the sealed injunction envelope. His tools were quiet ones, signatures, filings, truth recorded in voices. He straightened the papers, the faintest hint of satisfaction in his gaze. Across town, Caldwell would be raging, Nathan would be drowning. And Harold Jennings, patient, deliberate Harold, was already one move ahead. He turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle. This wasn't over, but now it was his game. The winter morning broke cold and merciless over downtown Richmond. The wind carried that brittle edge only January could deliver, and yet, inside Caldwell Enterprises' marble tower, the air was even sharper. Harold Jennings stepped through the revolving doors in a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, not new, but pressed and dignified. The receptionist glanced up, startled by his calm authority, as if she expected a delivery man instead of a storm. He didn't wait for an escort. He knew exactly where he was going. The elevator ride to the 34th floor was silent, except for the steady hum of machinery, and in the mirrored doors, Harold studied his reflection. The face staring back at him was older, yes, but there was something new there too, steel beneath the wrinkles. When the doors opened, a young assistant tried to stop him. "Sir, Mr. Caldwell is in a closed meeting." "I'm the meeting," Harold said. His voice left no room for question. Down the hallway, the glass doors to the main conference room were already open. Inside, Victor Caldwell sat at the head of the table, a half-drunk coffee steaming beside him. Nathan was 2 seats away, looking hollow-eyed, sleeves rolled, the posture of a man already halfway broken. Around them sat 3 attorneys in dark suits, their laptops open like shields. Victor looked up, amused. "Well, look who's joined the party. We don't usually invite retirees to the boardroom, Harold. Did you miss your senior discount breakfast?" Harold didn't answer. He walked slowly to the table, the sound of his shoes echoing off the polished floor. He placed a thick manila folder on the table, its contents sealed by a single paper clip. Victor raised an eyebrow. "What's this? Early tax season?" Harold met his gaze squarely. "Evidence." Nathan shifted in his seat. "Dad, don't," Harold said quietly, the word cutting like a blade. Victor smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Evidence of what, exactly? That you've forgotten how to read legal documents?" Harold slid the folder toward him. "Evidence of deed manipulation, false filings, and equity laundering. You used my home as collateral to fund a shell deal. You forged signatures twice. I have certified copies and witness verification from the county office. The smirk faltered for the briefest second. Victor looked down, flipping through the first few pages. His jawline tightened. Each document landed like a nail hammered into the table. Across the room, one of Caldwell's lawyers frowned as he skimmed a page. "Mr. Caldwell," he said carefully, "these are concerning." He turned another page, slower this time. "If verified, this would constitute criminal fraud, potentially felony level depending on the valuation." Victor shot him a glare, sharp enough to silence, but the attorney kept reading. The room grew quieter with every turn of the paper. Nathan's face had gone pale. His eyes darted between his father and Caldwell like a child caught between fire and flood. I didn't know the filings went that far," he said under his breath. Harold looked at him, steady but cold. "You signed them, Nathan. That's as far as it goes." Victor snapped the folder shut and forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. "You think this will hold up in court? You and your little paralegal friend can wave papers all you want, but business is built on leverage, not sentiment." Harold smiled faintly, a small, knowing thing. "Then I suppose you should have kept some." The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. One cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, if there's any truth to this, we need to prepare for a compliance audit. These filings alone could trigger state review." Victor's hand tightened on his pen until it snapped. The sound cracked through the silence. For the first time, the balance in the room shifted. Victor Caldwell, the man who had spent a lifetime commanding fear, looked, if only for a second, human. Harold gathered the remaining documents, stacking them neatly. "You'll receive official notice from my attorney by Monday morning," he said, tone calm, almost polite. "But I wanted to deliver the news personally." Nathan stared at him, eyes wide, a tremor in his voice. "Dad, please, can't we just—" Harold turned to him, cutting him off with a look that held both grief and resolve. "You chose your seat, son. All I did was take mine back." He paused at the door, adjusting his cufflinks. Then, with a wry half-smile, he looked back over his shoulder. "Merry belated Christmas." No one laughed. Victor said nothing. His hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder, the coffee beside him now cold. Harold walked out of the room without another word, the echo of his steps following him down the hall. Behind him, the silence was total, the kind that comes not from peace, but from power shifting hands. Outside, the winter light poured through the windows, blinding and clean. Harold stepped into the elevator, exhaling slowly, his reflection once again staring back at him. He straightened his tie, eyes steady. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had changed, and this time he was winning. As the doors slid shut, the last image was Victor Caldwell in the conference room, motionless, staring at the evidence that might one day bear his downfall. The meeting adjourned in silence. The morning after the deposition, the news spread quietly but efficiently through Richmond's business circles. Caldwell Enterprises was under review. Victor Caldwell hated that word. It sounded too close to investigation, too close to weakness. In his office, the blinds were drawn tight, the room thick with the smell of burnt espresso and tension. Nathan sat across from him, eyes bloodshot, collar unbuttoned. Caldwell stood at the window, back turned, phone in hand, his voice low and dangerous. "They think they got leverage," he muttered. "That old man and his lawyer, parading evidence like they're untouchable." He turned, his gaze slicing toward Nathan. "You let him get inside your head. You let him humiliate us in our own boardroom." Nathan's voice cracked under the weight. "He's my father, Victor. What did you expect me to do? Have him dragged out?" "I expected you to control him," Caldwell snapped. "But if you can't control him as a son, then you'll do it legally." Nathan blinked. "Legally?" Caldwell poured another espresso, his tone cooling. "There's a process called guardianship, elder care, cognitive decline, whatever label makes the courts listen. You file a petition claiming he's unfit to manage his finances. The moment that hits the docket, his accounts freeze, his legal standing weakens, and every move he makes after that looks erratic." Nathan recoiled. "You want me to say he's senile?" I want you to say he's vulnerable, Caldwell corrected smoothly. The courts love a story about protecting the elderly. Use his late wife's death, the isolation, whatever plays clean. You do that, and this investigation becomes background noise. Nathan hesitated. The silence stretched until Caldwell leaned forward, voice like gravel. You either control the narrative or your father will. By that afternoon, the paperwork was filed. Nathan's signature appeared again, this time beneath a petition for temporary guardianship of estate and finances for Harold Jennings, age 68. The language was sterile, the phrasing careful, but the betrayal was unmistakable. When Rachel received the alert through the county court tracker, she swore under her breath and immediately called Harold. Guardianship? He repeated, voice steady but eyes narrowing. They're really trying to paint me as incompetent? Rachel was already typing as she spoke. That's Caldwell's play, classic power grab. They're betting the court will panic about elder exploitation and put everything under review. Harold leaned back in his chair, a small, grim smile forming. Then let's give them a surprise. 2 hours later, Rachel's countersuit was already in motion. Attached to it was a sealed document from Harold's primary care physician and psychologist, a full cognitive evaluation from 3 months prior. The report concluded, no signs of cognitive decline, full mental competence, exceptional executive function. When Caldwell's legal team opened the response packet the next morning, the reaction was volcanic. Nathan's lawyer paled. Caldwell's jaw clenched. What was meant to be a trap now looked like premeditated malice. This test is recent, the attorney said, flipping through the pages. He's fine. We can't sustain the motion. It'll look like elder abuse. Caldwell slammed his hand against the table. We're not backing down because of one doctor's letter. Not one, the lawyer corrected carefully. 2. His psychologist and his physician both signed affidavits. If we press, we could be accused of harassment. The words hung in the room like smoke. Nathan sat motionless, staring down at the polished table. He could see his reflection in the wood, small, distorted. He knew, he said quietly. He must have had that test done months ago, just in case. Caldwell turned to him, eyes narrowed. Then he was preparing for war long before you noticed. Maybe he was always ready, Nathan said. For a second, Caldwell didn't respond. Then he straightened, forcing composure back into his voice. We pivot. We'll argue stress-related instability, something that suggests confusion under pressure. I'll have PR draft language that frames it as concern, not accusation. But the damage was already done. When the presiding judge assigned to review the guardianship case was announced, Caldwell's expression darkened further. Judge Holloway, a retired family friend, Harold's ally, the man who'd known both him and Margaret for 40 years. Rachel almost laughed when she read the name on the docket. Of all the judges in Virginia, she said, talk about poetic luck. Harold's reply was simple. No, not luck. Timing. 3 days later, the court's scheduling clerk called to confirm the public hearing date. The guardianship motion had drawn community attention. It would be open to the public, cameras included. That evening, Harold and Rachel met in her office, reviewing strategy. She pointed to the stack of filings, her eyes alight with purpose. Caldwell just exposed his flank. He tried to paint you weak, and now he's made you visible. Everyone will see what he's trying to take. Harold nodded slowly, the faintest smile touching his lips. Now, he said, folding his glasses and setting them down, we're playing chess. Rachel tilted her head. And his next move? Harold looked toward the window, where city lights shimmered like pieces on a board. Doesn't matter, he said quietly. He's already lost his queen. Outside, the courthouse clock struck 6. The case was officially listed, Caldwell versus Jennings. Guardianship petition hearing January 28th, public session. As Harold stepped out into the winter dusk, his breath visible in the cold air, there was no fear in him now, only calculation. The game was public, the stakes personal, and for the first time, everyone would see exactly who had been pulling the strings. The hearing was set. Snow drifted down over Richmond like a quiet reckoning. The courthouse steps glistened under a pale December morning, every flake catching light before melting into the cold stone. Inside, the air was thicker than winter itself, tension heavy, voices hushed as the Jennings family took their seats in courtroom 4B. Harold sat beside Rachel at the defense table, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His suit was simple but immaculate, his eyes sharp, steady. Across the aisle, Victor Caldwell whispered to his lawyer, his expression one of forced composure. Nathan sat beside him, jaw tight, unable to meet his father's gaze. Chloe fidgeted 2 seats away, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse like she was trying to wring the guilt out of it. The room murmured when Judge Holloway entered, a tall, silver-haired man with the bearing of someone who still believed in truth, even when it hurt. His gavel struck once. Court is now in session. Rachel rose first, calm and composed, her voice smooth as glass. Your Honor, before proceeding, I'd like to state that this case, a guardianship motion filed under false pretenses, was intended not to protect, but to manipulate. The evidence will show coercion and fraudulent motive. Caldwell's lawyer smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. Objection to the theatrics, Your Honor. My clients are motivated by concern for Mr. Jennings, not greed. The man is clearly acting out of vengeance against his son and his son's family. Holloway's gaze cut through the noise. You'll have your chance to speak, Counselor. Continue, Ms. Dorsey. Rachel nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Jennings is neither confused nor incompetent. In fact, he's been the victim of calculated financial exploitation by his own family and by the man who orchestrated it, Mr. Victor Caldwell. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. Caldwell sat motionless, his jaw working silently. The opposing lawyer stood, voice smooth but poisonous. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Caldwell, is a respected businessman. To suggest that this elderly gentleman was somehow exploited is absurd. We're talking about a man, Harold Jennings, who has made repeated erratic decisions, driven by resentment. He's not protecting his legacy. He's trying to destroy his son's future. This, the lawyer gestured toward Harold, is a vengeful patriarch lashing out. The words stung, but Harold didn't flinch. He simply glanced toward Rachel, who gave the slightest nod. It was time. Permission to submit Exhibit C, Rachel said, holding up a small silver USB drive. An audio file sent directly from a minor witness, Ellie Jennings, age 14, recorded voluntarily. Caldwell's attorney frowned. You can't. Holloway raised a hand. Let's hear it. Rachel plugged the drive into the courtroom laptop. The speakers crackled for a moment before a voice filled the room. Chloe's voice, sharp, frantic, echoing with the unmistakable sound of truth. Your dad will ruin everything. Do you understand that, Nathan? Everything. He'll see we're not stupid. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Nathan's face drained of color. Caldwell sat perfectly still, the muscle in his jaw twitching. The recording continued, her words trembling, desperate, unmistakably condemning. When it ended, silence fell heavy as snowfall. Rachel's tone remained measured. That was recorded 2 weeks ago, uncoerced. It clearly demonstrates knowledge of misconduct and intent to defraud. My client is not a vengeful man. He's a father, protecting what's left of his family's integrity. The judge turned toward the plaintiff's table. Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Jennings, do you have any response? Caldwell leaned back in his chair, a hollow smirk forming. Fabrications, edited sound bites. You think this proves anything? But Nathan didn't speak. His eyes were locked on the floor, hands trembling. He whispered something only Chloe could hear, something that made her shoulders shake before she started crying quietly into her hands. Judge Holloway's gavel struck once, firm and final. Enough. His voice carried through the room like thunder over a frozen lake. This court has seen many things, greed, deceit, arrogance, but rarely have I seen them so neatly disguised as family concern. He leaned forward, his gaze cutting through Caldwell's defense like a blade. This is contempt disguised as family. The room went still. Even the court reporter paused for a heartbeat before resuming her typing. The guardianship petition, Holloway continued, is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the prior injunction filed by Mr. Jennings stands, effective immediately. Ownership of all disputed property and financial assets is reinstated solely under Harold Jennings, legally bulletproof as of this ruling. Caldwell's mask of control fractured for the first time. His lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Nathan slumped back in his seat, face pale, his career and his alliances crumbling silently beside him. Rachel exhaled quietly, her shoulders finally lowering. She turned to Harold, who gave her the smallest nod of thanks. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but none of it touched him. He rose slowly, buttoning his coat, and looked once toward the opposite table. His eyes met Nathan's, not angry, not triumphant, just resolute. Then he turned away. Outside, the snow was still falling. As Harold stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the cold air hit his face like absolution. Cameras flashed from a distance, reporters calling questions he didn't answer. Rachel joined him, folder in hand, smiling faintly. "You just won Christmas," she said softly. Harold's gaze drifted upward to the gray sky, his breath fogging the air. "No," he said, calm, reflective. "I just took it back." He started down the steps, each footstep measured, the sound fading into the soft hush of snow. Behind him, the courthouse doors closed on the echoes of Caldwell's fury and Chloe's tears. Ahead of him lay the clean, cold air of justice served, and something unfinished still waiting in the quiet that followed. The courthouse corridor was a tunnel of echoes, heels, whispers, the hum of voices leaking from open doors. Outside, the storm had thinned into a steady drift, flakes melting as they hit the glass. Inside, the verdict still hung in the air, heavier than any sound. Chloe Caldwell Jennings was the first to move. She pushed through the courtroom doors so hard they banged against the walls, the sound cracking through the hush like a gunshot. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she spat at no one in particular, her voice trembling with fury and humiliation. Her heels clacked against the marble as she stormed down the hallway, clutching her bag like a shield. Victor followed a few steps behind her, slower, quieter. His face was carved into stillness, but the silence around him was dangerous. His hands stayed at his sides, every movement measured, like a man holding back a flood. He didn't look at anyone, not Harold, not Nathan, not even Rachel, who stood by the railing, watching him leave with the expression of someone witnessing a predator finally caged by his own pride. When the elevator doors closed behind them, the tension in the hallway didn't vanish, it just shifted. Nathan was still there. He stood near the bench, coat draped over one arm, tie loosened, eyes blank. The arrogance that used to define him had drained away, leaving something almost childlike behind. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just stared at the floor tiles, tracing their patterns as if they might lead him out of the mess he'd built. Harold approached slowly, his cane clicking softly against the stone. Rachel hung back, understanding instinctively that this conversation wasn't hers to witness. The father stopped a few feet away from his son. The silence between them was thick, the kind that doesn't need words to sting. "You chose his table over mine," Harold said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they landed like judgment. Nathan flinched. "I didn't think it'd go this far," he said, voice cracking. "Dad, I swear, I just thought it was business. I didn't know he'd—" Harold cut him off, his tone steady, not cruel. "You didn't think. That's your problem. You never think. You just eat." Nathan's face tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to find some excuse buried in the mess of greed and pride. But there was nothing left to reach for. Everything was exposed now. The forged signatures, the lies, the way he'd let another man replace his father at the head of the table. Harold's eyes didn't soften. There was grief there, yes, but it was grief forged into something harder. "You let them steal from me, Nathan," he said, voice low. "But worse, you let them steal you." Nathan's shoulders sagged. "I thought I was doing what was best for us, for Ellie." "For Ellie?" Harold repeated. "You think dragging her into a family built on lies was what's best? She's the only one in this family who still knows right from wrong." Nathan's eyes glistened, the shame visible now. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. You didn't mean to do anything, Harold said. That's the problem. He took a slow step forward, close enough that Nathan could see the exhaustion in his father's face, the kind that comes not from age, but from disappointment. Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came. The hallway seemed to close around them, the sound of a distant gavel echoing faintly from another courtroom down the hall. Then Harold turned. It's over, he said, and not because you lost. Because I stopped playing your game. He started walking toward the exit. Each step was slow, deliberate, the sound of his shoes against marble sharp as punctuation. Rachel moved to follow, but paused long enough to glance at Nathan. There was no pity in her expression, just quiet understanding. Some lessons, she knew, couldn't be softened. Outside, the cold air hit Harold's face like an old truth returning. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped down the courthouse stairs. The city moved quietly around him, distant traffic, the low hum of life continuing. Rachel caught up, slipping her arm through his for balance on the icy steps. You all right? She asked. He nodded once. I've been worse. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened again. Nathan stood there for a moment under the stone arch, framed by the gray sky, watching his father walk away. He didn't call out, didn't move, just stood, small against the world he'd tried to control. Down by the curb, a car waited, Harold's old Buick idling gently, heater fogging the windows. Through the glass, Ellie sat in the passenger seat, bundled in her red scarf, her small hands folded tight in her lap. When she saw her grandfather approaching, her eyes filled with tears. But there was something else in them too. Pride. Harold smiled faintly as he opened the door. You shouldn't be here, he said softly. I wanted to see, she whispered. He looked back toward the courthouse one last time. Nathan still stood at the top of the stairs, snow collecting on his shoulders. For a second, their eyes met across the distance, father and son, separated by choices neither could undo. Then Harold got into the car, closing the door with quiet finality. The engine hummed. As they drove off, the courthouse disappeared behind the falling snow. Ellie reached over, placing her small hand on his. He didn't speak, but he squeezed her fingers gently. The snow thickened outside, the city fading into white. Somewhere behind them, Nathan's figure blurred into the distance, still standing alone on the steps, watching, waiting, unsure if redemption was still something left to chase. The morning broke quiet over Richmond, the kind of pale winter calm that arrives after a storm. The streets were blanketed in snow, the air still, and in that silence, something shifted. The world hadn't yet caught up to the news, but Harold Jennings had. He was up before dawn, as always, the smell of coffee drifting through the small kitchen. The radio murmured low in the background, local traffic, weather updates, and then a faint note of urgency slipping through the announcer's calm tone. In breaking business news, the voice said, Caldwell Enterprises is now the subject of a state investigation into fraudulent property dealings and falsified loan documents. Harold didn't flinch. He reached for the folded Richmond Chronicle on his porch, brushing off a layer of frost. The front page was dominated by the headline in bold, black ink. Caldwell Enterprises under investigation for fraudulent property deals. The subheading told the rest. Sources close to the case confirmed that new evidence, including recordings and legal filings, led to a state audit into corporate mismanagement and misuse of client-owned collateral. Rachel's timing, as usual, was immaculate. Harold poured himself another cup of coffee, the sound of the liquid filling the mug oddly comforting. He set the newspaper down on the table, glasses perched low on his nose, and read every line. There was no triumph in his face, just quiet acknowledgement, the satisfaction of balance restored. He could picture her now, Rachel, sitting in her office, probably sipping her own coffee, pretending she hadn't been the one to leak the story. She'd tell him later that it was public interest, or ethical transparency. But Harold knew the truth. This was precision. This was justice, delivered in print. Across town, the effects rippled like shockwaves. At Caldwell Tower, chaos replaced order. Reporters camped outside the building, cameras flashing as executives hurried through the revolving doors. The once silent marble lobby was now filled with the sharp click of heels and the constant buzz of cell phones. Victor Caldwell arrived late, his chauffeur pulling up to a crowd of journalists. He stepped out, wearing his usual tailored suit, but the mask of confidence had cracks now. "Mr. Caldwell, is it true your company falsified property documents? Are you cooperating with investigators? Did you use the Jennings property as collateral for shell accounts?" He said nothing, pushing through the noise, jaw tight, eyes dark. In the reflection of the glass doors, he caught his own image, once untouchable, now cornered. The empire he'd built on greed and intimidation was collapsing faster than he could contain it. Upstairs, his office phone rang endlessly. Board members called for emergency meetings. Investors demanded explanations. Legal counsel advised him to stay quiet until advised. The headlines had already sealed his fate. His name was now synonymous with scandal. By noon, the stock value of Caldwell Enterprises had dropped 30%. His business partners began cutting ties, their polite public statements reading like obituaries. "We are shocked and saddened by recent allegations." Caldwell stared at the city skyline from his office window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. The snow outside was relentless, cold, pure, cleansing. Meanwhile, Nathan Jennings was sitting at his own desk, in the smaller office Caldwell had once gifted him, a gesture of favor that now felt like a curse. His inbox was flooded, subject lines in all caps, HR notices, urgent calls, and finally, the one that ended it all. Subject, termination. Notice, due to corporate downsizing. He read it twice, the words blurry but undeniable. The company he'd betrayed his father for was disintegrating under him, and all his supposed loyalty had bought him nothing. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank wall across from him. No framed awards now, no laughter from the corner office, just silence. His phone buzzed once, Chloe's name. "Pack your things," she said flatly when he answered. "We're done." "Chloe, please." "No, Nathan. You've cost us everything. My father's reputation, our name, our life." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her tone stayed cold. "I'm leaving before you drag me down with you." The line went dead. Nathan sat there for a long moment, the sound of the empty office humming in his ears. He looked out at the skyline, the same city his father had built bridges through, the same city now watching him fall apart. At that same moment, back in his modest kitchen, Harold turned another page of the paper. His eyes scanned the smaller headline near the bottom. "Family connections named in investigation. Unconfirmed sources mention internal whistleblower." He smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting as he stirred his coffee. Christmas came early, he murmured to himself. The clock ticked softly in the background. The world outside went on, neighbors scraping their driveways, the hum of a snowplow on the street. But inside Harold's home, it felt like the air had shifted. The balance was back. He walked to the window, the mug warm in his hands. Across the yard, Ellie was outside, building a snowman, her laughter faint but bright through the glass. Harold watched her for a moment, his reflection faint in the window beside hers. The man who'd been humiliated at his own table, who'd been written off as weak and senile, now stood exactly where he'd started, quiet, steady, undefeated. He set the mug down, folded the newspaper neatly, and glanced at the empty chair across from him, the one that had once belonged to Margaret. "Your boy's learning," he said softly, almost like a prayer. The snow fell heavier outside, blanketing the ground, the street, and the remnants of Caldwell's empire. In a downtown trash bin, a torn copy of the Richmond Chronicle fluttered in the wind, its headline still visible, "Caldwell Enterprises under investigation." The story had only just begun, but for Harold Jennings, the chapter that mattered most had already been written. He turned away from the window, the faintest smile still on his face, as the sound of Ellie's laughter carried through the cold morning air. The title deed arrived on a cold February morning, delivered in a plain white envelope that somehow felt heavier than anything Harold had ever held. No fanfare, no ceremony, just paper and ink confirming what he already knew. The house on Wisteria Drive, his house, was his again. Sole ownership, finalized, bulletproof. He stood in the foyer holding it, the winter light cutting through the curtains, dust motes swirling in the air like ghosts, finally leaving the room. For months, the house had felt divided, a battlefield disguised as home. But now the air felt cleaner, lighter, like it could breathe again. He laid the deed on the kitchen table and traced his name at the bottom, the ink signature neat and unshaken. Harold Jennings, owner. The war was over. But rebuilding, that was something else. In the weeks that followed, the house became a quiet construction site. Harold didn't hire anyone. He didn't trust contractors or consultants anymore. He worked alone, his hands steady, the familiar rhythm of repair giving his mind purpose. The first thing to go was the dining table, the very one where he'd once been told to move, as though years of sacrifice could be pushed aside like an empty plate. He took it apart plank by plank, sanded each piece, and rebuilt it, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. The sound of the sander filled the afternoons, blending with the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of his thoughts. He replaced the warped boards, polished the surface, and refinished the edges. When it was done, the table gleamed softly under the overhead light, a new beginning made from old wood. Then came the chairs, the ones that had witnessed the betrayal. He replaced them all, 6 in total, each identical sturdy oak, their polish deep and rich. But when he set them around the table, he left the head seat open. Rachel noticed it the first time she visited. She stepped into the dining room, her heels tapping lightly on the polished floor, the faint scent of varnish still hanging in the air. She looked around, nodding in quiet approval. "You did all this yourself?" she asked. "Old habits die hard," he said with a small smile. "I built bridges for 40 years. Figured I could handle a dining room." Her eyes softened as they fell on the empty chair at the head of the table. "You're keeping that one empty?" He paused, glancing at it. The sunlight from the window fell directly across the seat, highlighting it like a stage spotlight. "For whoever remembers respect," he said simply. Rachel nodded slowly, understanding without needing to ask more. She placed a folder on the table, the finalized legal documents. "You're clear, Harold. Every tie's been cut. The title's clean. The house, the land, the trust. It's all yours." He nodded, but there was no visible pride, no smugness, just peace. "It's not about owning it," he said after a moment. "It's about restoring what they tried to erase." Rachel smiled faintly. "You did more than that. You made sure no one could do it again." He chuckled quietly. "You're still my late wife's best decision." She laughed. "And don't you forget it." When she left, the house fell back into its soft, familiar silence. But this time, the quiet didn't ache. It felt alive. That evening, Ellie came over to help him decorate, as she called it. She brought her favorite apron, 2 small boxes of new tableware wrapped in bright paper, and a determination that only a teenager could carry. "Grandpa," she said, setting the boxes on the counter, "Mom said you're hosting Easter dinner here." He smiled gently. "Seems like the right place for it." She began unpacking plates, simple white ceramic with a faint silver rim. "I picked these," she said proudly. "They reminded me of Grandma's." He froze for a moment, the mention of Margaret's name cutting through him like a familiar song. "She'd like that," he said softly. Ellie moved around the room with care, setting each plate in place, aligning the silverware, straightening napkins. "You know," she said after a while, "Mom's been different lately, quieter. I think she misses everyone being together." Harold nodded, his gaze steady. "Some distances are meant to teach, not divide." Ellie tilted her head. "So you're not mad anymore?" He thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "Anger's heavy. I've carried enough." She finished placing the last fork, then turned to him. "It looks perfect," she said. He looked around. The table gleamed under the soft light. The chairs stood in silent symmetry, each one reflecting its own small story. The empty seat at the head glowed faintly under the fading sun, untouched but full of meaning. He reached out, straightened one napkin, and nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. Ellie stepped closer, holding a small glass ornament, a leftover from Christmas she'd found in one of the boxes. Let's hang this, she said, so it catches the light. She placed it by the window, where the sun streamed through the glass. When it caught the rays just right, the light fractured across the table, scattering color like a quiet blessing. Harold stood there, watching the light dance over the wood, the silver, the white plates, all of it new, yet rooted in memory. It wasn't about revenge anymore, or justice, or winning. It was about reclamation, the quiet, stubborn act of taking back what mattered and making it whole again. The house no longer carried the weight of betrayal. It carried the warmth of history restored. Ellie leaned her head against his arm. Grandpa? She smiled. It feels like Grandma's here again. He looked down at her, then at the light spilling through the window. She never left, he said softly. The last of the winter sun spread through the glass, spilling gold over the table, the chairs, and the single empty seat that seemed to glow brightest of all. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, dripping gently from the eaves. Inside, the air felt new, like spring waiting at the doorstep. Harold reached out, turned off the lights, and let the natural light fill the room. The house had found its voice again. The sign outside the roadside motel flickered between vacancy and darkness, its buzzing hum the only sound breaking the night. Nathan Jennings sat in the corner of the small room, half-empty bottle on the table, the television muttering static nonsense to itself. The air smelled of old smoke and regret. The wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the carpet, stained, worn, indifferent, reflected the man who sat among it. He poured another glass. His hands shook as the whiskey sloshed against the rim. It wasn't the drink that burned anymore. It was the silence. Silence from his wife, who'd left. Silence from his daughter, who no longer looked at him the same. And the worst of them all, silence from his father. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes bloodshot. Every sound from the world outside, the hiss of tires, the whine of wind, felt like judgment. The door knocked once, soft, hesitant. He froze. No one knew he was here. Not his coworkers, not Chloe. No one. He stood, unsteady, and opened the door. Ellie stood there, bundled in her red coat, snow melting on her shoulders. Her small face looked older somehow, too much truth in eyes that should have still been innocent. Ellie, he said, his voice a rasp. How did you... Grandma's old address book still had your name under this motel, she said simply. I took Mom's car. He stared at her for a long second, then stepped aside. You shouldn't be here. She came in anyway, closing the door behind her. The room seemed even smaller now, the single lamp flickering across the cracked mirror. She looked around, then at the bottle. You're drinking. He gave a hollow laugh. Yeah, guess it's what losers do. She didn't respond. She just stood there, the silence between them louder than his self-pity. Finally, she said, You need to go home. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. Home? There's no home for me left, not after what I did. Grandpa's house, she said. He's there. You can still fix it. He laughed again, but this time it was softer, sadder. He'll never forgive me, Ellie. She looked at him then, not as a child to a father, but as someone who'd already seen what pride costs. He already did, she said quietly. That's why it hurts more. Nathan's breath caught. The words hit deeper than anything he'd heard in months. He sat back down on the edge of the bed, staring at his trembling hands. The sound of the old heater filled the silence, a low rattle like a tired heart. He looked up at her, tears brimming but unfallen. You don't understand. I destroyed everything he built. I let Caldwell use me like a pawn. I tried to take the only thing he had left. She sat beside him, small and steady. Then, don't let that be the last thing you do. He exhaled slowly, the weight of every mistake pressing down on him. For a moment, he saw himself years ago, the young man who'd once looked up to Harold like a compass pointing true north. That man was gone. But maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the direction he'd lost. He glanced toward the bottle, then pushed it away, the glass tipping and spilling across the table. "Let's go," he said quietly. Ellie smiled faintly, relief flickering in her eyes. "You sure?" He nodded, voice steady for the first time. "If I don't do it now, I never will." The drive back was silent. Snow fell harder, thick flakes swirling in the headlights. Nathan kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the tires filling the air where words couldn't. Ellie sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look scared. She looked hopeful. When they reached Wisteria Drive, the house looked the same, and yet completely different. Warm light spilled from the windows, and through the glass, Nathan could see the new table, polished and whole. He stopped the car at the curb. His throat tightened. "Go ahead," he said softly. Ellie shook her head. "You're the one who needs to knock." He nodded slowly and stepped out into the snow. Each step toward the porch crunched loud in the night, echoing against the quiet street. He paused at the door, hand hovering for a moment before he finally knocked. Inside, footsteps approached. Then the door opened. Harold stood there. No surprise, no anger, just stillness. The light behind him framed his shoulders, turning him into a shadow against warmth. Neither spoke for several seconds. The only sound was the faint whistle of the winter wind through the trees. Nathan began, but the words broke in his throat. He tried again, quieter this time. "I'm sorry." Harold didn't move. His face gave nothing away. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, opening the door wider. Nathan hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The air smelled like coffee and pine. He looked around, the restored furniture, the calm simplicity of it all, and something in him cracked open. Harold didn't say anything. He just gestured toward the dining room. Nathan followed. The table gleamed under the soft light. 6 new chairs, 1 empty seat at the head. Without being told, Nathan sat at the far end, the opposite of where he'd once displaced his father. He lowered his head, ashamed, hands folded tightly in his lap. Harold walked past him, slow, steady, and took his place at the head of the table. They didn't speak. Instead, Harold reached for a plate, passed it across the table toward Nathan, and nodded once. A quiet invitation. Nathan accepted it with shaking hands. For the first time in years, they ate together. No words, no accusations, just the soft sounds of silverware and the faint creak of the old house settling around them. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't warmth, but it was peace. Fragile, quiet, real. When the meal was done, Harold looked up at his son, his voice steady, almost gentle. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll talk." Nathan nodded, tears shining but unfallen. "Yes, sir." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the old scars of the driveway, the lawn, the past. Inside, father and son sat in silence, not as enemies or strangers, but as 2 men trying to find their way back to something that once was home. The snow finally began to melt. The icicles that had clung stubbornly to the eaves of the Jennings house dripped one by one, the sound gentle and rhythmic, like time exhaling after holding its breath for too long. March had arrived, soft and forgiving, washing away the scars of winter. The yard, once buried under white, revealed patches of green fighting their way through. For the first time in months, Harold opened his front window and let the air in. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee steaming beside him, the morning sun spilling through the curtains. The house felt alive again. The silence was no longer heavy. It was calm, full. On the table, among neatly stacked documents and the Sunday paper, lay a single envelope with the courthouse seal. He picked it up, the paper thick and official, but when he turned it over, he recognized the handwriting on the back. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten, old-fashioned, deliberate. He opened it carefully. "Harold, there aren't many men left who stand their ground when the world tries to strip it from them. I watched you do it, not with anger, but with dignity. You reminded this town that integrity still has a pulse. I'm proud of you, old friend." Holloway Harold folded the letter and smiled faintly. Judge Holloway's words carried the weight of something earned, not given. He set the note beside the window where sunlight caught the ink and made it glow. Outside, children biked through the slush, their laughter echoing down the street. Neighbors waved when they passed. It had been weeks since the courtroom verdict, but word of what Harold had done, standing up against his son, against power, against quiet exploitation, had traveled through Richmond like fire through dry grass. People he hadn't spoken to in years had started stopping by again. A bag of groceries on his porch one day, a letter of thanks another. At first, he didn't know how to receive it, but over time, he realized it wasn't about pity. It was respect. Quiet, unspoken respect. That Sunday, the air was bright and cold as he walked up the steps of St. Matthew's Church, the same church where he and Margaret had been married 43 years ago. Its bell rang across the thawing town, deep and steady. Inside, the congregation buzzed softly. Familiar faces murmured greetings, the smell of wood polish and candle wax. He hadn't been here since the trial, not out of shame, but because he'd needed to find his footing again. Now, as he stepped through the aisle, heads turned, people nodding in acknowledgement, not curiosity. Rachel sat near the back, smiling when she caught his eye. Nathan wasn't there, but Ellie was, sitting in the front row, hair tied neatly, wearing the same red scarf she'd worn all winter. Pastor Daniels approached him before the service began, a warm hand on Harold's shoulder. "You've done something this town won't forget," he said quietly. "We've all been watching." Harold nodded. "I didn't do it to be watched." "That's why it mattered," the pastor said. He took his seat. The service began. Hymns, prayers, scripture, and it all felt heavier, deeper now. When the announcements ended, the pastor cleared his throat. "Before we close, we have a small dedication. This morning, our choir has a soloist, someone singing on behalf of her grandfather." Harold blinked. His head turned towards the altar. Ellie stood there, clutching the microphone with both hands. The first notes of the piano drifted softly through the church. Familiar, timeless. Amazing grace. Her voice began as a whisper, pure but trembling at first. Then it grew, steady, full of warmth that filled the vaulted ceiling and every empty corner. Harold felt something in his chest loosen. Around him, people closed their eyes, some mouthing the words quietly. He didn't move. He just watched her, his granddaughter, the bridge between what had been broken and what could still be whole. When she reached the final verse, her eyes found his. For a moment, it felt like Margaret was there too, her smile, her grace, all of it shining through this young girl's voice. Tears welled, unbidden, but welcome. He didn't wipe them away. They weren't tears of regret anymore, but of release. When the song ended, silence filled the church, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Then soft applause rose, humble and heartfelt. Ellie stepped down from the altar and went straight to her grandfather's pew. She didn't speak. She just wrapped her arms around him. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, the warmth of family restored. Not perfect, not the same, but real. As the service ended and the congregation filed out, Harold stayed behind for a moment. The morning light streamed through the stained glass, scattering color across the wooden pews, reds, blues, and golds, shimmering like fragments of something sacred. He looked at the letter in his pocket, then at Ellie's small hand, slipping into his. "Your grandmother would have loved that," he said softly. Ellie smiled. "I think she heard it." They walked toward the door together, the sound of the bell tolling behind them. Outside, the snowmelt shimmered on the pavement, reflecting the morning sun. For the first time in a long time, Harold didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down. He felt it settling, like earth after rain, firm and ready to grow something new. And as they stepped out into the crisp March air, the town that had once whispered about him now nodded with quiet respect. It wasn't victory. It was peace. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, blending with the faint sweetness of cornbread cooling on the counter. The house on Wisteria Drive no longer echoed with tension. It hummed with quiet life. Easter had arrived, soft and gentle, as if the season itself knew this family needed peace more than celebration. The dinner was smaller now. No elaborate centerpieces, no glittering plates or catered dishes. Just Harold's old oak table, a simple cloth, the hum of the oven, and the laughter of one child moving between the rooms. The air carried something lighter than it had in months, something that felt like forgiveness, learning to breathe. Nathan stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed in concentration as he stirred a pot of gravy. His movements were careful, deliberate, almost reverent. Gone was the arrogance, the impatient tapping of a man waiting for others to serve him. Now he measured, tasted, adjusted, quietly, humbly. Ellie peeked over his shoulder. "You're actually pretty good at this," she said with a grin. He chuckled softly. "Don't sound so surprised. Your grandfather used to make me help your grandmother every Easter. I just stopped paying attention somewhere along the way." "You're paying attention now," she said simply, and that was enough. In the dining room, Harold set out the silverware. His hands were steady, his movements slow but sure. The house had been repaired, restored, but this moment, this dinner, felt like the true reconstruction. He could hear Nathan moving in the kitchen, the sound of utensils and sizzling pans blending into something that almost sounded like healing. Rachel arrived right as the last dish was placed on the table. She carried a bottle of wine and a small smile. "I didn't want to come empty-handed," she said. Harold took the bottle from her. "You've already given me more than I can repay," he said, setting it down gently. She smiled wider. "Then let's just call this interest." The table looked modest but inviting. Chicken, vegetables, biscuits, and nothing fancy. The new chairs gleamed under the soft light, and at the head of the table sat the one empty seat, still kept open, just as Harold had promised. But tonight, it didn't feel like a void. It felt like an invitation, for peace, for memory, for the unseen presence that still lingered in the corners of the house. When everyone sat down, Ellie reached for Harold's hand before anyone else moved. "You sit first," she said, her small voice filled with purpose. He blinked, surprised, then smiled as warmth tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Now that's manners," he said softly. He pulled out the head chair and sat, the room falling quiet for a heartbeat. Light from the window spilled across the table, catching on the dishes, the polished wood, and the faces gathered there. For the first time in what felt like years, there was no tension, no pretense, only presence. Nathan placed the last bowl down and took his seat at the far end. He cleared his throat, looking nervous but resolute. "Before we start," he began, eyes fixed on the table, "I just want to say thank you." Harold looked up, meeting his son's gaze across the table. Nathan continued, "For letting me come back, for this meal, for not slamming the door." Rachel leaned back slightly. Watching father and son across from her, her expression unreadable but kind. Ellie reached for her dad's hand, squeezing it. "You can make the toast," she whispered. Nathan smiled faintly, then lifted his glass of water. His voice wavered at first, but steadied with each word. "2-second chances," he said. The words hung in the air, simple, fragile, real. Harold raised his glass too, his eyes glistening. "And to learning what matters the first time," he added quietly. Rachel lifted hers next. "To families that fall apart," she said softly, "and still find their way back." Glasses clinked. The sound was soft but full, echoing through the house with something close to grace. Dinner began, conversation flowed, not about the past, but the little things. Ellie's school project, Rachel's upcoming case, the flowers beginning to bloom outside the churchyard. It wasn't the loud, polished noise of big family dinners. It was quieter, truer. Harold looked around the table, at the son who had finally stopped running, the woman who had stood beside him through every storm, the granddaughter whose courage had mended what age and pride had broken. He didn't need to speak. His silence said everything. This is what survival looks like. As the meal went on, the sun dipped lower, spilling golden light through the windows. It fell across Harold's face, warm and gentle, the kind of light that makes you believe in renewal. He leaned back, watching them laugh softly, talk freely, live without the shadows that once filled this room. His heart felt full, not of pride, but of peace. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the last man standing at a broken table. He felt like the head of a family again. The glasses clinked one final time, the sound blending with the fading light. Harold smiled. Small, quiet, but sure. The camera would linger there, the table bathed in sunset, Ellie's laughter soft in the background, and Harold's face catching the last glow of day. The scene would fade, not into darkness, but into light. The afternoon sun stretched across Harold's study, warm and golden, touching the stacks of paperwork spread across his desk. The house was quiet, except for the slow tick of the clock and the faint hum of the furnace. Outside, the last traces of winter clung to the edges of the lawn, patches of melting snow reflecting the light like broken glass. Rachel sat across from him, a leather folder open in front of her. She flipped through the pages with careful precision, her reading glasses low on her nose. "This is it," she said, sliding the top document toward him. "Your estate trust, finalized and recorded. The assets are consolidated, your name secured on all holdings, and Ellie's listed as the primary successor." Harold nodded, scanning the pages, the lines of fine print reflecting in his glasses. "You've outdone yourself, Rachel," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "You've kept me busy." He picked up his pen, the weight of it grounding him. Every signature in that packet was more than ink. It was permanence, protection, insurance against the kind of betrayal that had nearly hollowed him out months ago. But as he reached the final page, his hand paused. "Something missing?" Rachel asked, sensing the hesitation. Harold studied the document a moment longer. "One last clause," he said. Rachel blinked. "We've already covered contingencies, medical, financial, power of attorney." "Not that kind of clause." He turned the page over and gestured for her to take a note. "Add a restriction." Her brows furrowed. "On what?" He looked up, eyes sharp but calm. "Ownership. Add that no in-law, present or future, may ever hold a controlling share in any Jennings property or trust." Rachel lowered her pen slowly. "That's specific." He leaned back, his voice measured, resolute. "They took my seat once. They won't take the table again." Rachel exhaled through her nose, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "You sure you want to put that in writing? Feels a little—" She searched for the right word. "Be petty." Harold chuckled quietly, the sound low but warm. "No," he said. "Preventive." For a moment, they both sat in silence, the kind of silence that only comes after surviving something together. The sunlight caught the edge of his wedding band, a simple gold ring still worn, still polished. It glinted across the desk as he signed his name one last time, Harold Jennings. Rachel gathered the papers neatly, slipping them into the folder. "That's it then," she said. "It's all settled." Harold stood, stretching his back, feeling the old ache of his age but none of the weight of defeat. "No," he said thoughtfully. "It's all restored." Rachel smiled, understanding. She closed the folder, tapping it once against the desk to square the edges. "You did it, Harold. You protected what mattered." He looked toward the window, where the last of the snow dripped from the eaves, each drop catching light before falling into the soft ground below. "I didn't protect it," he said quietly. "I rebuilt it." Rachel stood and gathered her coat. "You've earned some peace," she said, heading for the door. "Try not to go looking for another battle." "I'm retired," he said with a small grin, "from war and from family politics." "Good," she said, smiling back. "You're better at winning than most people can handle." She left, the sound of the door closing softly behind her. Harold walked to the window and stood for a while, watching the yard. The snow was giving way to grass again, thin green threads pushing through the cold. A robin landed on the fence, bright against the pale wood. He slipped on his jacket and stepped outside. The air was crisp, but no longer biting. The wooden porch creaked under his weight as he stepped out into the sunlight. The snowmelt ran in thin rivulets down the driveway, carrying winter away in quiet surrender. He looked out at the yard, at the old oak tree that had seen generations of Jenningses come and go, and let out a slow, even breath. The house behind him glowed warm through the windows, Rachel's paperwork sealed, Ellie's laughter still lingering from her last visit, and the steady hum of a life repaired. He leaned on the railing, watching the light shift across the horizon. His voice came soft, steady, like the closing line of a story finally complete. "They took my seat once," he said, half to himself, half to the wind. "I built the whole table." The wind caught the words and carried them down the quiet street, disappearing into the distance. As the light faded, Harold turned toward the front door. He flipped the porch switch on his way in. The bulb above the door glowed warmly, steady and bright against the encroaching dusk. The camera would linger there, a final image of light against the dark, a life rebuilt, guarded, and at peace. The porch light stayed on,